The crystal champagne flutes clinked as Diane arranged them perfectly on the head table. One for Robert, one for Melissa, one for Daniel, one for herself. My heart sank as I realized once again there wasn't a place set for me. "Susan," Diane called out, her voice sweet as honey but sharp as a knife beneath. "Would you mind sitting at the small table by the kitchen? We need to make room for the Johnsons at the main table. They're significant donors to Robert's campaign." As my husband of 30 years avoided my eyes, I quietly retreated to the tiny corner table with my plate of food that had already gone. Cold. 3 years I'd endured since Robert's political career took off. 3 years of gradually being pushed to the margins of my own marriage. But that night, at what was supposed to be our wedding anniversary celebration, after discovering what was hidden in our prenuptial agreement, I finally found the courage to speak my truth. The words I said made Diane leave not just the banquet hall, but the entire campaign team. And nothing in our family would ever be the same again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Susan Miller, though everyone called me Susie until Robert won his first election. At 52, I'd seen enough of life to recognize when someone was systematically trying to erase me from my own narrative. The signs weren't obvious at first. They never are when you're being slowly removed from your own life. Looking back now, I can pinpoint exactly when it all began. Though I was too blinded by loyalty and love to see it clearly then, Robert and I met during our sophomore year at Westfield State College. I was studying English literature with dreams of becoming a teacher. He was a political science major with vague ambitions of making a difference. We were an unlikely match. According to our friends, I was creative, talkative, and wore my heart on my sleeve, while Robert was methodical, reserved, and calculated every decision. But somehow, we balanced each other perfectly. I brought spontaneity to his structured world. He provided stability to my creative chaos. We married 2 years after graduation in a modest ceremony at my parents' church in Riverdale. Robert's family insisted on a prenuptial agreement, not because they were particularly wealthy, but because they owned a small manufacturing business they hoped Robert would eventually take over. I signed without much thought, certain we would build our life together as equal partners regardless of legal technicalities. For 27 years, that's exactly what we did. I taught middle school English while Robert worked his way up from the family business to local government, starting as a city council member. We raised 2 children, Melissa, now a pediatrician in Seattle, and Daniel, a software engineer in Austin. We built a comfortable life in our 4-bedroom colonial on Maple Street, hosting neighborhood barbecues and school fundraisers, taking modest vacations to national parks and beach rentals. It wasn't glamorous, but it was genuine and it was ours. Everything changed 3 years ago when Senator Harrison announced his retirement. Local business leaders approached Robert about running for the vacant seat, citing his experience on the city council and his family's long-standing reputation in the community. The prospect energized him in a way I hadn't seen in years. "This is our chance to really make an impact, Susie," he said, his eyes alight with possibility. "Not just for Riverdale, but for the entire state." I noticed his use of "our," a subtle acknowledgement that this decision would affect us both, and it reassured me. This would be our journey together, just like everything else we'd faced in our marriage. That illusion lasted exactly 2 weeks, until the day Diane Campbell swept into our living room like a perfectly tailored tornado. She came highly recommended as a campaign strategist who specialized in elevating local politicians to state-level positions. At 45, she radiated the particular confidence of someone who had never doubted her own expertise. Her sleek bob and immaculate pantsuits became fixtures in our home as kitchen table conversations transformed into strategy sessions. I still remember the first time she assessed me openly, her eyes scanning from my practical bob, cut for easy maintenance in a classroom full of 13-year-olds, to my department store blazer and comfortable shoes. "We'll need to make some adjustments," she said, not unkindly but with the clinical detachment of someone diagnosing a problem. "Voters in the northern counties respond to a certain type of political spouse. More Ann Romney, less, well." She didn't finish the sentence, but her gesture toward my general appearance made her meaning clear. I wasn't sophisticated enough, polished enough, or, though she would never say it directly, young enough to be the asset Robert's campaign needed. "Susan has been by my side for 27 years, Robert said, putting his arm around my shoulders. "The voters will respect that commitment." "Of course they will," Diane agreed smoothly. "And we'll emphasize that loyalty and longevity. We just need to package it appropriately." I should have recognized the warning in her words. Package me, like a product that needed rebranding. But I was caught up in Robert's excitement, willing to make adjustments for this new chapter in our lives. When Diane suggested I take a leave of absence from teaching to support the campaign full-time, it seemed reasonable. When she recommended a refreshed wardrobe and a more camera-ready hairstyle, I complied without much resistance. The changes were subtle at first. My casual input during strategy meetings was increasingly met with polite nods, followed by redirected conversations. Photo opportunities that once included both of us gradually shifted to focus solely on Robert, with me positioned just out of frame or in easily cropped positions. My speaking roles at campaign events diminished from introducing my husband to standing silently beside him to eventually watching from the audience. "It's just that Robert needs to establish himself as the candidate," Diane explained when I finally questioned these changes. "Voters need to connect with him directly. Once he's elected, there will be plenty of opportunities for you to have a more visible role." I believed her because I wanted to believe her. I believed her because the alternative, that I was being systematically removed from my husband's public life, was too painful to acknowledge. Most of all, I believed her because Robert seemed to believe her, adopting her language and perspectives with increasing conviction. 6 months into the campaign, our home no longer felt like ours. The comfortable furniture we'd selected together was placed in storage, replaced by rental pieces that photographed better for at-home interviews. Family photos were curated to emphasize Robert's most flattering angles and accomplishments. Even our bedroom, once a private sanctuary, was rearranged to create better backdrops for morning news remote interviews. The campaign headquarters, established in the refurbished Wellington building downtown, became the center of our lives. Robert's corner office featured large windows, elegant furnishings, and walls adorned with carefully selected photographs charting his rise from local businessman to potential state senator. My designated space was a converted storage area near the back stairs. "So you won't be disturbed by the constant campaign traffic," Diane explained, though we both knew the real. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "She's reading as too traditional." "She's my wife of nearly 30 years, Robert replied, but his tone lacked conviction. "People expect to see her involved." "Involved, yes. Centered, no," Diane countered. "Look, Robert, this isn't personal. It's strategic. Susan represents a chapter of your life that resonates with certain demographics, but she doesn't project the dynamic, forward-looking image we need for the broader voter base. The suburban soccer mom vote is already secured. We need to capture the young professionals and urban voters." There was a pause, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for Robert to defend me, to challenge Diane's clinical reduction of our marriage to a demographic liability. "What do you suggest?" he asked instead, and I felt something crack inside me. "We continue to minimize her presence at major events. When she does attend, we keep her remarks scripted and brief. For the anniversary celebration next month, we Structure it as a campaign fundraiser that happens to coincide with your anniversary, rather than a personal milestone that's being leveraged for the campaign. The 30th anniversary is significant, Robert said, a note of hesitation in his voice. Susan will expect something meaningful. And it will be meaningful, politically meaningful, Diane assured him. We'll honor the longevity of your marriage while using the opportunity to connect with major donors. We'll seat her with some of the campaign volunteers rather than at the head table, which gives you freedom to circulate among the influential attendees. I backed away from the door, a hollow feeling spreading through my chest. This wasn't just about campaign strategy or political image. This was about my erasure, not just from public materials, but from meaningful participation in my own marriage. The anniversary celebration Diane described wasn't a celebration of our 30 years together at all. It was a campaign event that used our milestone as convenient window dressing. That night, I said nothing to Robert about what I'd overheard. Instead, I retreated to our home office after he'd fallen asleep and began searching through the filing cabinets where we kept important documents. I wasn't sure what I was looking for until I found it. The prenuptial agreement I'd signed as a 22-year-old bride, full of legal language I hadn't fully understood at the time. I read it carefully now, page by page, until I reached a clause that made me stop and read again. In the event the marriage exceeds 25 years, all assets acquired during the marriage shall be considered joint property, regardless of the name in which such assets are held, in recognition of the enduring partnership established by such longevity. I sat back in the office chair, my mind racing. 25 years. We had been married for nearly 30. According to this document, all assets acquired during our marriage, including Robert's campaign funds, speaking fees, and the consulting business he'd established after leaving his family's company, were legally considered joint property. The implications were staggering. The next morning, I called the one person I knew would give me honest guidance, Catherine Bennett, my college roommate who had become one of the most respected family attorneys in the state. She was also one of the few people from before who Diane had systematically excluded from our social circle, citing Catherine's occasional TV appearances as a legal commentator as potentially conflicting messaging. "I need your professional opinion on something," I said when she answered. "Confidentially." 2 days later, I sat in Catherine's office as she reviewed the prenuptial agreement and the financial records I'd gathered from our home files. "This is surprisingly straightforward, Susan," she said, looking up from the documents. "After 25 years of marriage, you're entitled to half of everything, including the campaign funds structured as personal loans and all the speaking engagement fees that have been directed to separate accounts." "What does that actually mean in practical terms?" I asked. "It means you have significant leverage," Catherine explained. "Robert's campaign finances are structured in a way that blurs the line between personal and political funds, a common practice, but one that becomes complicated when marital assets are involved. If you were to assert your rights under this agreement, it would create not just financial consequences, but potentially political ones as well." I didn't make any decisions that day. Instead, I spent the next week watching how completely I had been relegated to the periphery of Robert's life. At a campaign breakfast, my name tag placed me at a table with office interns while Robert and Diane sat with local business leaders. At a strategy meeting, my suggestion about education funding was acknowledged with a polite nod before the conversation immediately returned to Diane's talking points. Even at home, Robert and I existed in parallel rather than together. Our conversations, limited to logistical matters rather than the genuine exchanges we'd once shared. As plans for our anniversary celebration, or rather, the campaign fundraiser that coincided with our anniversary, took shape, I remained outwardly compliant. I approved the invitation wording that described the event as honoring Senator Miller's 30 years of dedication to family values, rather than celebrating our marriage. I accepted the royal blue dress Diane selected as on brand with the campaign, Colors, though it was a shade I'd never particularly liked. I reviewed and memorized the 3 approved talking points I would be permitted to mention if asked about our marriage by attendees. All while Catherine prepared the documents that would establish my legal rights to equal partnership in everything Robert and I had built together. "Are you planning to file for divorce?" Catherine asked when she delivered the final paperwork, her eyes concerned. "I honestly don't know," I admitted. "First, I need to find out if the man I married still exists somewhere inside Senator Miller. What happens next depends entirely on his response." The night of the anniversary celebration arrived with perfect spring weather, the kind of evening we would once have spent on our back porch with glasses of wine and easy conversation. Instead, we arrived separately at the grand ballroom of the Riverdale Hotel. Robert coming early with Diane to approve final arrangements, me arriving later in a campaign car sent to deliver me at the designated time. The ballroom had been transformed, with campaign colors and subtle nods to our anniversary. The flower arrangements included a few lilies, my wedding bouquet flower, though they were dyed blue to match the campaign palette. Large photographs of Robert's career achievements lined the walls, with our wedding photo included as just one milestone among many. Diane intercepted me as I entered, steering me toward a small table positioned near the kitchen doors. "We've arranged for you to sit here so you can personally thank the campaign volunteers," she explained, though we both knew it was to keep me away from the influential donors seated at the main table. I nodded with the docile compliance. "Susan, is everything all right?" she asked, her smile fixed but her eyes wary. "Everything is about to be," I replied, continuing past her toward the small stage where the anniversary toast was scheduled to occur. Diane followed, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "We discussed the schedule. Robert will give the main toast in 15 minutes after the governor arrives. You'll have a brief moment after to thank everyone for coming." "Plans have changed," I said, stepping onto the stage and approaching the microphone. The room gradually quieted as people noticed me standing at the podium, a departure from the carefully orchestrated program. I saw Robert looking toward me, in confusion, as Catherine continued speaking to him, now showing him what appeared to be documents from the folder she carried. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "For those who may not know me, I'm Susan Miller. Today marks 30 years since I married Robert." A murmur of polite applause rippled through the room. Diane had reached the edge of the stage, her expression a mixture of fury and panic as she made a slashing motion across her throat, signaling me to stop. "Many of you were invited here to celebrate that milestone," I continued, ignoring her. "But as you might have noticed, this event has very little to do with our marriage and everything to do with political positioning. My assigned seat is by the kitchen doors. My role has been reduced to thanking volunteers, and my husband spent more time reviewing donor seating arrangements than reminiscing about our 3 decades together." The room had fallen completely silent now. Robert was moving toward the stage, Catherine following close behind with the open folder. Diane had frozen in place, clearly calculating whether rushing the stage would create a greater spectacle than allowing me to continue. 3 years ago, I agreed to support my husband's political ambitions, I said, my voice gaining strength. I took a leave from the teaching career I loved. I accepted a new wardrobe, a new hairstyle, a new way of speaking that was deemed more electable. What I did not agree to, however, was my complete erasure from our partnership. Robert had reached the steps to the stage, his expression unreadable. I met his eyes directly for what felt like the first time in months. "I recently discovered something interesting in our prenuptial agreement," I continued. "After 25 years of marriage, all assets acquired during the marriage become joint property, regardless of whose name appears on the accounts. This includes the campaign funds structured as personal loans, the speaking fees directed to private accounts, and the consulting business established using our shared savings and connections." Diane had recovered enough to climb the stage steps, positioning herself between me and Robert. "This is completely inappropriate," she hissed. "This is a campaign event with major donors present." "That's exactly my point, Diane," I replied, loud enough for the microphone to catch. "Our 30th wedding anniversary has been completely hijacked to become a campaign event. My husband's marriage has been treated as a biographical detail to be managed rather than a partnership to be honored. And I've allowed it to happen, until tonight." I turned my attention back to the room full of guests, many of whom were watching, with undisguised fascination. "I'm not here to create a political scandal. I'm here to reclaim my voice in my own marriage. For 3 years, I've been told where to sit, when to speak, how to dress, and which parts of my personality are politically advantageous. I've been pushed to the margins of my husband's life because I've been deemed too ordinary, too teacher-like, too middle-aged to benefit his political image." Robert had finally reached my side, Catherine standing just behind him with the documents clearly visible. "Susan," he said quietly, "we should discuss this privately." "We're long past private discussions," I replied. "Our marriage has been public property since the moment you announced your candidacy. The difference is that tonight, I'm choosing how that story is told." I faced him fully now, lowering my voice so the microphone barely caught my words. "You have a choice to make, Robert. Not as a candidate, but as my husband. You can continue allowing our marriage to be managed as a political asset, or you can remember that before you were Senator Miller, you were the man who promised to be my partner in everything. Catherine has the documentation that establishes my legal rights in all we've built together. What happens next is up to you." For several long moments, Robert stood motionless, looking between me and the papers Catherine had handed him. Then his gaze moved past me to the room full of donors, supporters, and political allies watching this unexpected drama unfold. I could almost see the calculations running behind his eyes. The political implications, the potential headlines, the campaign messaging challenges. Then something shifted in his expression. A softening around the eyes that reminded me of the man I'd married 3 decades earlier. He turned to Diane, who was frantically whispering something about damage control and messaging strategy. "That's enough, Diane," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "This event is over." "Robert, you can't possibly," she began. I said, "Enough." He turned back to me, taking both my hands in his. "Susan, I owe you an apology that will take far longer than a single evening to properly express. Somewhere along this political journey, I lost sight of what matters most. I allowed our partnership to be redefined by poll numbers and donor demographics rather than the commitment we made to each other 30 years ago." The microphone caught his words, broadcasting this unexpected moment of vulnerability to the entire room. A few people shifted uncomfortably, while others watched with expressions ranging from confusion to something like respect. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert addressed the crowd. As we walked through the ballroom toward the exit, several guests approached to shake our hands or offer congratulations that seemed more genuine than political. The crystal champagne flutes still stood in perfect formation on the head table, untouched, symbols of an event that had transformed into something entirely unexpected. Outside in the warm spring evening, Robert loosened his tie and took a deep breath. "I don't know where we go from here," he admitted. "The campaign, our marriage, I've made a mess of both tonight." "Actually," I said, "I think tonight might be the first step toward fixing both." "But we start with us, Robert. The campaign will have to wait." We drove in silence through the quiet streets of Riverdale, the familiar route home feeling somehow different in the aftermath of what had just happened. The campaign car we'd arrived in had been dismissed. Instead, we took Robert's personal vehicle that had sat largely unused since the campaign began. As he pulled into our driveway, the motion sensor lights illuminated the front of our Colonial that had gradually transformed from home to campaign backdrop over the past 3 years. "Should we go inside?" Robert asked, his hand hesitating on the ignition key. "No," I said after a moment's consideration. "Not yet. I don't want to have this conversation in a house that doesn't feel like ours anymore." He nodded in understanding, backing out of the driveway. Without discussion, he turned toward Riverside Park, where we'd spent countless Saturday mornings during the early years of our marriage, walking along the tree-lined paths while planning our future together. The park was nearly empty at this hour, illuminated by vintage-style lampposts that cast pools of warm light along the main walkway. Robert found a parking space near the entrance, and we made our way to a bench overlooking the river, the water reflecting the distant lights of downtown. For several minutes, we sat in silence, the evening breeze carrying the scent of late spring blossoms. "I didn't know about the provision in the prenup," Robert finally said, his voice quiet. "About everything becoming joint property after 25 years. "Neither did I until recently," I admitted. "Your parents' lawyer included it, I suppose as acknowledgement that a marriage lasting that long represents a true partnership." "They would be disappointed in how I've handled things," he said, surprising me with this moment of self-awareness. "Dad always said the business was successful because he and Mom built it together, even though only his name was on the paperwork." I turned slightly to study his profile in the dim light. The campaign had aged him, new lines around his eyes, a certain tightness around his mouth that hadn't been there before. Yet underneath, I could still glimpse the thoughtful, deliberate man I'd married. "When did we start drifting apart, Robert?" I asked. "Was it only the campaign, or did it begin before that?" He considered this carefully, in the methodical way that had once balanced my more intuitive approach to problems. "I think the seeds were planted when the children left for college," he said finally. "We'd spent so many years focused on being parents that we'd forgotten how to be just Robert and Susan. The campaign filled that void with something that felt purposeful. But it also gave you an identity separate from ours," I pointed out. "Senator Miller instead of just Robert." He nodded slowly. The transition was seductive. Suddenly, people were listening to my ideas, treating me as someone important. Diane recognized something in me, ambition I hadn't fully acknowledged, and she knew exactly how to nurture it, while systematically eliminating anything that didn't fit her vision for your political future, I added, unable to keep the edge from my voice. "Including me." "I let it happen," he acknowledged, turning to face me directly. "That's the part I'm most ashamed of. I watched you being sidelined and told myself it was temporary, necessary, part of the political game. I justified it by thinking of the good we could accomplish once I was in office." "We?" I questioned. "Or you?" His shoulders slumped slightly. "I honestly don't know anymore." The line blurred somewhere along the way. A comfortable-looking older couple walked past, arms linked, nodding pleasantly as they continued their evening stroll. I wondered if they recognized Robert from his campaign posters that plastered the town, or if they simply saw what I saw, a middle-aged couple having a serious conversation on a park bench. "When did you first notice things changing between us?" Robert asked, his tone genuinely curious rather than defensive. I considered the question, wanting to be precise rather than emotional. It was gradual, but I remember a specific moment about 2 months into the campaign. We were at the Harvest Festival, the first major public event after you announced your candidacy. Diane handed me a set of talking points about our marriage, bullet-pointed anecdotes she deemed relatable to potential voters. "I remember that day," Robert said, frowning slightly. "You seemed quieter than usual afterward." "Because I realized our actual marriage was being replaced by a curated version for public consumption," I explained. The real stories, the struggles we'd overcome, the private jokes, the complex reality of 30 years together, were considered too messy, too authentic for campaign purposes. "What specific memories did she omit?" Robert asked, seeming to genuinely want to understand. Everything that made us real people rather than political archetypes, I said. There was nothing about how we nearly separated during your father's illness because we were both stretched so thin. Nothing about the financial struggles when we were both just starting our careers. Nothing about how we actually met. Because apparently a college party isn't sufficiently dignified for a future senator's origin story. A small smile crossed his face. You dumped your drink on me because you thought I was someone else. I was aiming for Brian Thompson, who had been spreading rumors about my roommate, I confirmed, feeling a surprising warmth at his remembering this detail. You were just unfortunately standing in the wrong place. Best mistake anyone ever. Made in my direction, he said, the familiar phrase from our wedding vows hanging in the air between us. We fell silent again, the shared memory creating a momentary connection that felt both comforting and painful given the distance that had grown between us. What do you want, Susan? Robert finally asked. After everything that's happened, after tonight, what outcome are you hoping for? It was the most direct question he'd asked me in months, free from political calculation or Diane's messaging strategy. I took my time answering, knowing we had reached a crucial juncture. I want to be seen again, I said finally. Not as a campaign asset or liability, not as a demographic checkbox, but as your equal partner. I want our marriage to be a real partnership again, not a biographical detail in your candidate profile. And the campaign? He asked carefully. I've never objected to your political ambitions, Robert. What I object to is being erased from my own life to further them. I turned to face him directly. If you want to continue the campaign, I'm willing to support that, but as your authentic partner, not as a carefully managed prop. No more separate tables at events. No more scripted interactions. No more being hidden away because I'm too ordinary or teacher-like for the campaign aesthetic. He was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. And if the political advisors say that approach won't win the election, then you'll have to decide what matters more to you, winning at any cost or maintaining the integrity of our relationship, I said simply. I can't make that choice for you. Robert stood suddenly, pacing a few steps away before turning back to me. Do you know what's ironic about all this? He asked, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so familiar it made my heart ache. The entire campaign has been built around family values and long-term commitment, while simultaneously dismantling the actual foundation of my own marriage. Diane would call that effective messaging strategy, I noted dryly. Diane sees people as political instruments, not as human beings, he replied with surprising vehemence. I've known that for months, but convinced myself it was necessary. That her approach was the price of accomplishing greater goals. At what point does the price become too high? I asked softly. He returned to the bench, sitting closer to me than before. I think we reached that point tonight, watching you seated alone by the kitchen doors at our own anniversary celebration. He shook his head, genuine regret evident in his expression. When did I become someone who would allow that to happen? The same way the proverbial frog gets boiled, I said. Incrementally, so gradually you don't notice the rising temperature until it's too late. A comfortable silence fell between us, more reminiscent of our pre-campaign relationship than the tense, charged atmosphere that had characterized our recent interactions. In the distance, the lights of downtown Riverdale reflected on the river's surface, the small city we'd called home for 3 decades, continuing its evening rhythm unaffected by our personal drama. What happens now? Robert finally asked. That depends, I replied. Catherine still has those documents. Legally, I have significant leverage regarding the campaign finances and our joint assets. Are you planning to use it? His tone was curious rather than accusatory. That depends on you, I said honestly. I don't want to dismantle your campaign or create public embarrassment. What I want is for us to find our way back to a genuine partnership, whether that includes politics or not. Robert reached for my hand, his touch tentative as if unsure of his welcome. When I didn't pull away, he entwined his fingers with mine in a gesture that felt both familiar and new. "I need to make some significant changes," he said quietly. "Starting with Diane." "She won't go quietly," I warned him. "She's invested too much in crafting Senator Miller to watch him revert to just Robert." "I'm not planning to revert," he replied thoughtfully. "But I need to find a way forward that integrates who I've always been with who I'm becoming. And that includes honoring my marriage in more than just campaign rhetoric." As if on cue, Robert's phone began buzzing insistently in his pocket. He withdrew it, glancing at the screen with a grimace. "Diane, that's the 12th call since we left the hotel." "Are you going to answer?" I asked. He silenced the phone and returned it to his pocket. "Not tonight. Tonight belongs to us, the real us, not the campaign version." The simple statement felt like a small victory, a reclaiming of private space that had been increasingly consumed by political considerations. The Robert I'd married had always been able to compartmentalize, to set aside work concerns for genuine family time. Senator Miller, by contrast, had been perpetually available to campaign demands, ever mindful of optics and messaging opportunities. "Would you like to walk for a bit?" he suggested, nodding toward the riverside path that wound through the park. "Like we used to on Saturday mornings?" I nodded, feeling a cautious optimism as we rose from the bench and began strolling along the lamplit pathway. We weren't holding hands as we might have once done automatically, but we were walking side by side rather than with the carefully managed distance that had characterized our public appearances during the campaign. "Do you remember what this park looked like 30 years ago?" Robert asked as we passed the children's playground that had been renovated during his time on the city council. "It was much simpler. I'm proposing that if I continue this campaign, it becomes truly ours rather than mine. With you as an authentic partner, not a managed accessory. No more separate tables, no more scripted talking points, no more being positioned out of frame in photographs." "Diane would say that approach is political suicide," I noted, testing whether his resolve would falter at the mention of practical campaign considerations. "Diane has been wrong about many things," he replied firmly, "including the value voters would place on authentic relationship versus manufactured image. Besides," he added with a hint of the dry humor that had once been a staple of our private conversations, "I'm not sure Diane will still be managing the campaign after tonight." "You'd dismiss her? After everything she's built?" I was genuinely surprised by this indication of how deeply tonight's events had affected him. "I'm considering it," he acknowledged. "Though it might be more accurate to say she'll dismiss herself when she realizes I'm unwilling to continue with the current approach. Diane values winning above all else. If she believes my insistence on including you authentically jeopardizes that goal, she'll likely resign rather than compromise her strategy." We resumed walking, the path curving alongside the river where scattered benches provided views of the water. A young couple occupied one of them, heads bent together in intimate conversation, oblivious to passers-by or the larger world beyond, their shared space. "I've missed this," Robert said suddenly. "The park?" I asked. "No, well, yes, but more than that. I've missed us. The real conversations, the unguarded moments, the ability to speak without calculating the political implications of every word." He sighed heavily. "I've become someone who filters everything through a lens of public perception rather than personal truth. Even now, part of my brain is composing press statements about tonight's event. And what is this hypothetical press statement saying?" I asked, genuinely curious about how he would frame the evening's dramatic turn. "The official version or the honest one?" he asked with a wry smile. "Both." He cleared his throat, adopting the slightly more formal tone he used for campaign. "Communications." Senator Miller and his wife are deeply grateful for the support shown at their anniversary celebration. While the event concluded earlier than planned due to private family matters, the Miller campaign continues to focus on the core values of commitment and integrity that have characterized both the senator's 30-year marriage and his approach to public service. I couldn't help but laugh. Smoothly done. And the honest version? His expression softened, the campaign persona falling away. Robert Miller remembered tonight that he's been an absolute fool, allowing political ambition to undermine the most important relationship in his life. He's desperately hoping it's not too late to make amends and rediscover the partnership that has been the foundation of everything worthwhile he's accomplished. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, piercing through the protective layer of skepticism I'd developed over 3 years of gradual marginalization. For the first time in months, I was hearing my husband rather than the candidate, and the distinction was profound. "It's not too late," I said quietly, "but it will take more than words to rebuild what's been damaged." "I know," he acknowledged, "and I'm prepared to demonstrate that with actions, starting tonight." We had reached the small botanical garden that anchored the far end of the park, its pathways lined with flowering plants that released their fragrance into the evening air. During the early years of our marriage, we'd often brought a blanket here on summer evenings, spreading it on the grass for impromptu picnics while watching the sunset. "Remember that time Melissa found a frog here and insisted on bringing it home?" I asked, the memory surfacing unexpectedly. Robert's laugh was genuine, unfiltered by political considerations. She named it Senator Hopper and built it that elaborate habitat from her building blocks. That poor frog lasted exactly 3 days before escaping through the window, I recalled, smiling at the memory. "She was inconsolable until you explained that Senator Hopper had gone home to his frog family who missed him," Robert added. "You've always had that gift, finding the perfect words to transform difficult situations into manageable ones. A skill the campaign could have actually utilized rather than sidelined," I observed, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from my voice. Robert nodded, accepting the criticism without defensiveness. "You're right. The entire strategy has been fundamentally flawed, attempting to craft an image so divorced from reality that it required eliminating essential parts of who we actually are." We found an empty bench near a flowering magnolia tree. "Its I asked, the question a test of his earlier declarations. Robert typed a brief response, then turned the screen toward me so I could read it. "Not available. Spending the evening with my wife. We'll contact you tomorrow to discuss campaign restructuring." As I watched, Diane's reply appeared almost instantly. "Strongly advise against this approach. Multiple donors expressing concerns about stability of campaign after tonight's unexpected developments. Require your immediate presence to reassure key supporters." Robert's jaw tightened as he read this, but his response was calm and decisive. "My decision stands. No further communication tonight." He turned off the phone completely, something I hadn't seen him do since the campaign began, when he became perpetually available to staff and supporters regardless of time or personal circumstances. "She'll be furious," I observed. "Undoubtedly," he agreed, slipping the now silent phone back into his pocket. "But for the first time in 3 years, I'm making a decision based solely on what matters to me, not what advances the campaign." The simple act of turning off his phone felt symbolically significant, a small reclaiming of personal boundaries that had been increasingly eroded by political demands. We sat in companionable silence for several minutes, the night air growing cooler as the hour advanced. "Would you like to get some coffee?" Robert suggested eventually. "Miller's Diner should still be open." He smiled slightly at my surprised expression. "What? Too mundane for a state senate candidate?" "Too normal for the carefully managed public image Diane has constructed," I countered. "Senator Miller doesn't frequent local diners unless it's a scheduled campaign appearance with photographers present." "Well, Robert certainly does," he replied, standing and offering me his hand. Especially when he wants to continue an important conversation with his wife in a place that has figured in their relationship for 30 years. Miller's Diner, no relation despite the shared name, had indeed been a fixture in our marriage. Since we'd first moved to Riverdale, we'd celebrated there after closing on our house, had taken the children there for Saturday morning pancakes, and had spent countless date nights in the corner booth discussing everything from household budgets to dream vacations. The walk from the park to the diner took us through the heart of downtown Riverdale, past storefronts decorated with Robert's campaign posters. It felt surreal to walk alongside the larger-than-life images of my husband's smiling face, professionally, photographed and airbrushed to campaign perfection. "You know what's missing from every one of these posters?" Robert asked, noting my gaze. "What?" "You," he said simply. "The person who has shaped me more than anyone else isn't visually represented in any of my campaign materials. Diane insisted it presented a clearer, more focused message to feature just me, while simultaneously emphasizing family values and commitment," I noted with irony. "The contradiction was always there," he acknowledged. "I just chose not to see it." Miller's Diner was relatively quiet when we arrived, the dinner rush long over and only a few tables occupied by late-night patrons. The hostess, a young woman I didn't recognize, did a visible double-take when she saw Robert, clearly recognizing him from the ubiquitous campaign materials. "Senator Miller," she stammered, reaching for menus. "We're honored to have you visit. Would you prefer a private table in the back?" Before Robert could respond, a familiar voice called from behind the counter. "Put those folks in their regular booth, Kayla. They've been sitting there for 30 years. Edith Miller, the 70-something owner who had run the diner since taking it over from her father, emerged wiping her hands on her ever-present apron. Unlike the hostess, she showed no deference to Robert's political status. "About time you two showed your faces in here," she said, leading us toward the corner booth herself. "Got so fancy with your political life I thought you'd forgotten about regular folks." "Never, Edith," Robert replied with genuine warmth. "Just got caught up in things for a while." She responded skeptically. "Well, sit yourselves down. Coffee's fresh, and I've got a slice of apple pie with your name on it, Susan, still warm from the oven." As we slid into the booth, the vinyl seats showing their age but meticulously clean, I felt a wave of nostalgia for the countless conversations we'd had in this exact spot over 3 decades. Edith returned with 2 mugs of coffee and a generous slice of pie with 2 forks without being asked, then discreetly withdrew to give us privacy. "Some things never change," Robert observed, watching Edith return to the counter where she resumed conversation with a regular customer. "And some things change too much," I replied, thinking of how completely our relationship had been transformed by his political ambitions. "The question is whether they can change back," he said quietly, addressing the unspoken concern hanging between us. "Or perhaps not back exactly, but forward into something that honors what we've always been while accommodating what we might become." I took a sip of coffee, appreciating that Edith still remembered I took it black while Robert's had been lightened with cream. These small personal details had been increasingly lost in the campaign's rush to reshape our public narrative. "I'm not opposed to your political career, Robert," I said after a thoughtful pause. "I've always supported your desire to serve the community. What I can't accept is being treated as an inconvenient accessory rather than a partner." "That ends now," he said firmly. "If I continue the campaign, and that's a significant if at this point, it will be with you fully included as yourself, not as a carefully managed political spouse. And if the political advisors say that approach will cost you the election, then I lose the election," he replied with surprising equanimity. "But I refuse to lose my marriage in pursuit of political office." The simple declaration hung between us, its sincerity evident in his direct gaze and resolute tone. For the first time since the camp, he considered this as he sampled the pie. You think a more genuine approach might actually resonate better with voters? I think people are tired of perfectly packaged politicians who never speak an unscripted word, I replied. Your strongest quality has always been your sincerity, your genuine desire to solve problems and serve the community. Diane's strategy has systematically stripped away that authenticity in favor of focus-grouped messaging. Robert's expression turned thoughtful, including how our marriage has been presented, or rather, strategically edited for public consumption. Exactly, I confirmed. What if, instead of hiding me away because I'm too ordinary or teacher-like, the campaign actually embraced the reality of our 30-year partnership? Not as a political talking point, but as evidence of your genuine commitment to the values you espouse in your platform? A slow smile spread across Robert's face. Not the camera-ready expression I'd grown accustomed to seeing in campaign materials, but the genuine warmth that had first drawn me to him decades earlier. That approach would certainly constitute a dramatic shift in campaign strategy, he noted, the political consultant in him automatically assessing the tactical implications. And would likely prompt Diane's immediate resignation, I added. Which might be necessary regardless, given tonight's events, he acknowledged. The question is whether it's too late to redirect the campaign narrative this close to the election. I reached across the table to take his hand, the gesture feeling both familiar and new after months of carefully managed public interactions. That's a practical consideration for tomorrow. Tonight is about us deciding whether our marriage is worth fighting for, independent of political outcomes. It is, he said without hesitation. The campaign awakened an ambition I hadn't fully acknowledged, but tonight made me realize the cost has been far too high. I won't sacrifice our relationship for political advancement. Not anymore. As if to underscore his commitment, Robert's phone began vibrating in his pocket once again, despite having been turned off earlier. He withdrew it with a frown, revealing a different device than the one he'd silenced. His emergency backup that only key staff knew how to activate. Diane, he said, showing me the screen. She's persistent. I'll give her that. Are you going to answer? I asked, genuinely curious whether his resolve would hold against the campaign manager's determination. Robert silenced the second phone and returned it to his pocket. No. Whatever crisis she perceives can wait until morning. Tonight belongs to us. The simple statement felt like a victory, small perhaps in the grand scheme of political campaigns and public careers, but significant in the context of our marriage. For the first time in 3 years, Robert was choosing our relationship over campaign demands without hesitation or calculation. We stayed at Miller's Diner until closing time, talking with an openness we hadn't managed in years. The conversation wasn't always easy. There were moments of hurt acknowledgement, painful recognitions of how far we'd drifted apart, honest admissions of resentment and regret. But underlying it all was a mutual commitment to finding our way forward, whether that path included politics or not. As Edith flipped the closed sign on the door behind us, Robert took my hand naturally, our fingers interlacing as we began the walk home through the quiet streets of Riverdale. The campaign headquarters loomed ahead, lights still blazing despite the late hour, evidence of the crisis management undoubtedly underway following our abrupt departure from the anniversary event. Diane and the team are still there, I noted, nodding toward the illuminated windows. Let them work through the night, Robert replied with newfound conviction. Whatever statement they craft, whatever strategy they develop, nothing happens without our approval, yours and mine, moving forward. The use of our, rather than my, wasn't lost on me, a small linguistic shift that represented a potentially seismic change in approach. As we walked past headquarters without stopping, Robert's stance straight and determined despite the visible activity inside, I felt a cautious hope that perhaps tonight truly had marked a turning point, not just in the campaign, but in our marriage. The future remained uncertain, political careers hanging in the balance, campaign strategies in disarray, public narratives disrupted. But for the first time in years, I felt like an equal partner rather than a managed accessory in my own life. Whatever came next, we would face it together, authentically and honestly, no longer performing predetermined roles in someone else's political script. Morning arrived with the harsh clarity of decisions that couldn't be postponed any longer. I woke in our bedroom. The first time in months we'd slept in the same space without the careful choreography of campaign appearances dictating our interactions. Robert was already up, standing by the window that overlooked our backyard. Coffee, mug in hand, his silhouette outlined against the early sunlight. "How long have you been awake?" I asked, pushing myself up against the headboard. "About an hour," he replied, turning to face me. "Couldn't sleep past 5. Too many thoughts." He looked different somehow, less like Senator Miller and more like the Robert I'd known before politics consumed our lives. His hair wasn't perfectly styled. His posture lacked the camera-ready straightness Diane had drilled into him, and the expressions crossing his face weren't carefully calculated for public consumption. "I made coffee," he said, gesturing to a second mug on the nightstand. "And I disconnected the landline. Diane called 6 times between 6 and 7. I reached for the coffee, appreciating this small act of consideration. She won't give up easily." "No," he agreed, returning to sit on the edge of the bed. "She's tenacious. It's why she's effective at what she does. But this morning, she's calling a candidate who no longer exists." The statement hung between us, its implications too significant to be immediately unpacked. I sipped my coffee, gathering my thoughts before responding. "What exactly does that mean, Robert?" He set his mug down carefully, his movements deliberate in the way they always were when he'd reached an important decision. "It means I've spent the night reevaluating everything. The campaign, my political ambitions, our marriage, what truly matters at this point in our lives." "And what conclusions have you reached?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral despite the hope and trepidation warring within me. "That I've been pursuing political advancement at the expense of the relationship that has been the foundation of everything worthwhile in my life," he said simply. "And that needs to end, regardless of the political consequences." Before I could respond, his cell phone buzzed on the dresser. He glanced at it and sighed. "Diane again. That's call number 7. "Maybe you should answer," I suggested, "at least to let her know you're alive. She's probably imagining worst-case scenarios." "By now." Robert considered this, then nodded. "You're right." "But I'm putting it on speaker. No more private political conversations that shape our life without your input." He answered the call, immediately activating the speaker function. "Good morning, Diane." Finally. Her voice filled the room, sharp with tension. "Robert, we have a full-blown crisis situation. I've been trying to reach you all night. Where have you been?" "At home with my wife," he replied calmly, "as I told you I would be." "This is not the time for personal indulgences," Diane said, the disapproval evident in her tone. "The campaign is in damage control mode. 3 major donors have expressed concerns about last night's incident. The Courier is running a story with the headline, 'Miller Campaign Faces Internal Strife.' We need you at headquarters immediately to craft a response." Robert's eyes met mine across the room, his expression resolute. "Susan is with me now, Diane. You're on speaker." A moment of startled silence followed. "I see," Diane finally said, her tone shifting to the carefully modulated pleasantness she used when adjusting to unexpected circumstances. "Good morning, Susan. Perhaps we could schedule a time later today for the 3 of us to discuss how to move forward in a way that addresses everyone's concerns." "Actually," Robert interjected, "I've already made some decisions about moving forward. I'll be at headquarters at 9 to discuss them with the team." Excellent, Diane replied, relief evident in her voice. I've already assembled the communications. Staff and reached out to our media contacts to coordinate messaging. We're thinking a joint appearance with Susan would demonstrate unity while allowing us to reframe last night as a simple misunderstanding. That's not what we'll be discussing. Diane, Robert interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. I'll see you at 9. He ended the call before she could respond, meeting my questioning gaze with newfound certainty. You didn't tell her, I observed. Some conversations need to happen in person, he replied, especially ones that involve significant changes in direction. I set my coffee aside, suddenly very alert. What exactly are you planning to tell her, Robert? He moved to sit beside me, taking my hand in a gesture that felt both familiar and new after months of carefully managed interactions. That I'm reclaiming my campaign and my marriage from the artificial constraints she's imposed. That moving forward, you'll be fully included as my authentic partner, not as a carefully managed prop. That the scripted talking points and strategic distancing are finished. She'll quit, I said, not posing it as a question, but as a certainty. Probably, he acknowledged. Her entire approach is predicated on maintaining absolute message control. What I'm proposing runs counter to everything she believes about effective campaign strategy. I studied his face, searching for any hint of hesitation or doubt. Are you prepared for the potential consequences? This close to the election, losing your campaign manager could be politically devastating. I'm prepared to lose the election if necessary, he replied without hesitation. What I'm not prepared to lose is you, us, the relationship that matters, more than any political office. The simple declaration hung between us, its sincerity evident in his direct gaze. For the first time in 3 years, I felt I was seeing the authentic Robert rather than the carefully constructed Senator Miller persona. I'd like to come with you, I said, making a sudden decision. To the meeting with Diane and the team. Robert looked surprised but nodded. Are you sure? It might get contentious. I'm sure, I confirmed. If we're truly reclaiming our partnership, it starts now, not after you've had difficult conversations on your own. He smiled then, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. In a way his campaign smiles rarely did. You're right. We do this together or not at all. We arrived at campaign headquarters at precisely 9, entering through the front doors together rather than using the separate entrances that had become standard practice. Robert through the main lobby for maximum visibility, me through the side entrance to minimize my presence. The receptionist's eyes widened slightly at seeing us arrive as a unit, her gaze darting between us and the conference room where voices could already be heard. Senator Miller, she began, using the title that had become standard despite Robert, not yet holding the office. Ms. Campbell and the team are waiting in the conference room. They weren't expecting. She hesitated, looking at me uncertainly. My wife? Robert supplied, his tone pleasant but firm. She'll be joining all campaign meetings moving forward. Please update the standard protocols accordingly. Without waiting for a response, he placed his hand lightly on the small of my back, guiding me toward the conference room in a natural gesture of partnership that had been conspicuously absent from our public interactions during the campaign. Through the glass walls, I could see Diane standing at the head of the table, mid-presentation, with various staff members seated around her. Their conversation halted abruptly as we entered. Robert, excellent timing. Diane recovered quickly, her professional mask firmly in place despite the surprise evident in her eyes when she saw me. We were just reviewing the media response strategy. Susan, we hadn't planned for your attendance, but of course you're welcome to observe. Susan isn't here to observe, Diane, Robert said calmly, pulling out a chair for me at the table before taking the seat beside me. She's here as my partner, in every sense of the word. A flicker of something, concern, calculation, perhaps both, crossed Diane's features before she smoothly redirected. Of course. Now, as I was outlining for the team, we have prepared 3 potential narratives to address last night's events. Option 1 acknowledges the emotional significance of your anniversary, while emphasizing that momentary personal considerations sometimes require brief adjustments to public appearances. That won't be necessary, Robert interrupted, his tone respectful but firm. There won't be a prepared narrative about last night because there won't be any more strategic separation between my marriage and my campaign. The room fell silent, all eyes moving between Robert, Diane, and me as the implications of his statement registered. Diane's expression remained professionally neutral, but I noticed her knuckles whitening as she gripped her presentation folder. Perhaps we should discuss this privately, she suggested, her tone indicating this wasn't truly a suggestion. Anything you need to say can be shared with the entire team, Robert replied. Transparency will be a hallmark of this campaign moving forward, starting with the fact that my wife is my full partner, not a campaign asset to be managed based on demographic polling. Diane's professional demeanor slipped momentarily, genuine alarm replacing her calculated pleasantness. Robert, I understand last night was emotionally charged, but making campaign decisions based on personal feelings rather than strategic considerations would be a serious mistake at this stage. The mistake, Robert said quietly, was allowing my marriage to be systematically diminished for political expediency. That ends today. The communications director, a younger woman named Taylor who had always treated me with tentative kindness despite following Diane's protocols, cleared her throat nervously. What exactly are you proposing, Senator? Robert looked at me, a silent invitation to respond. I straightened slightly, unaccustomed to being addressed directly in campaign settings after months of careful sidelining. A return to authenticity, I said, finding my voice stronger than expected. No more separate tables at events, no more scripted interactions, no more being positioned out of frame in photographs. A campaign that reflects the reality of our 30-year partnership, rather than a focus-grouped simulation of family values. Diane shook her head, abandoning pretense. That approach directly contradicts everything our polling tells us about effective candidate presentation. The controlled narrative has increased your favorability by 17 points since the primary. Disrupting it now would be political suicide. Perhaps, Robert acknowledged. Or perhaps voters might respond positively to genuine partnership rather than carefully packaged imagery. Either way, it's non-negotiable. Moving forward, Susan is fully included as herself, not as a managed accessory. Diane looked between us, calculation evident in her expression as she assessed whether this was a momentary emotional stance or a firm decision. Apparently concluding it was the latter, she straightened and addressed the room with brisk professionalism. I'd like to speak with the Senator and Mrs. Miller privately. The rest of you, please continue preparing the press briefing materials. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. The staff filed out quickly, their expressions varying from confusion to curiosity. When the door closed behind them, Diane turned to face us directly, her professional mask falling away completely. What happened last night was unfortunate but manageable, she began, her tone clipped. What you're proposing now would undo 18 months of careful narrative construction weeks before the election. I cannot support such a fundamentally flawed approach. I'm not asking for your support, Diane, Robert replied calmly. I'm informing you of my decision. The campaign direction is changing, with or without your involvement. Diane's gaze shifted to me, her assessment cool and direct. Susan, I understand you felt marginalized by certain campaign strategies. That wasn't personal. It was simply what polling indicated would be most effective. Perhaps we could find a compromise that gives you more visibility while maintaining the narrative structure that's proven successful. This isn't a negotiation, I replied, meeting her gaze steadily. And it isn't about visibility or compromises. It's about honesty, in our marriage and in Robert's campaign. The current approach lacks both. Politics isn't about honesty, Diane said bluntly. It's about effective messaging that resonates with key demographics. Your authentic selves matter far less than the personas voters can connect with and support. That approach may win elections, Robert acknowledged, but it's destroying my marriage. And no political office is worth that price. Diane studied him for a long moment, her expression shifting from frustration to resignation as she recognized the finality in his tone. You realize what you're risking? Without consistent message discipline, without strategic positioning, your odds of winning decrease significantly. I'm prepared to accept that possibility, he said without hesitation. She turned to gather her materials, her movements precise and controlled despite the evident tension. Then you'll need to accept my resignation as well. I cannot attach my professional reputation to a campaign that rejects fundamental strategic principles weeks before an election. Though we'd anticipated this response, the finality of her statement still landed with considerable weight. For 18 months, Diane had been the architect of Robert's political rise, shaping every aspect of his public persona with meticulous attention to polling data and demographic analysis. I understand, Robert said, his tone respectful despite the circumstances. And I appreciate everything you've contributed to this campaign. Diane paused, her professional mask briefly slipping to reveal genuine conviction. You were positioned to win, Robert. With the current strategy, internal polling showed a 7-point lead. What you're proposing now, this abrupt shift to unfiltered authenticity, it's political malpractice. Perhaps, Robert conceded, or perhaps voters might respond to that went about as expected. She really believes in her approach, I observed, finding myself able to acknowledge Diane's conviction despite our fundamental differences. She does, Robert agreed. And she's not entirely wrong about the potential political consequences. Changing campaign direction this close to the election is unorthodox at best, potentially disastrous at worst. Are you having second thoughts? I asked, studying his expression carefully. He shook his head without hesitation. None. If maintaining Diane's carefully constructed narrative means continuing to diminish our marriage, the cost is too high, regardless of the political outcome. Before we could continue, a tentative knock at the door interrupted us. Taylor, the communications director, entered with a tablet in hand, her expression anxious but determined. Senator Mrs. Miller, she began, glancing between us. Ms. Campbell informed us she's resigning. The team needs guidance on immediate next steps. We have 3 interview requests regarding last night's events. Donors are calling for reassurance, and the Courier reporter is on deadline for tomorrow's front page story. Robert looked at me, a silent question in his expression. I nodded, slightly, encouraging him to take the lead while knowing I would be included in the decision-making process in a way I hadn't been for 3 years. Taylor, he said, his tone more relaxed and authentic than the carefully modulated campaign voice Diane had cultivated. There are going to be some significant changes in how this campaign operates moving forward. The first and most important is complete honesty about my partnership with Susan. No more strategic separation, no more scripted interactions, no more carefully managed photo opportunities. Taylor's expression reflected surprise, but not disapproval. So, for the pending media inquiries, we'll give one joint interview, I suggested, the plan forming as I spoke. Preferably with someone thoughtful who won't reduce this to sensationalized headlines. We addressed last night directly as a moment of reckoning about authenticity in both marriage and public service. Melissa Chen at The Observer, Taylor suggested, immediately. She's always pushed for substantive coverage rather than political theater. Robert nodded, the decision made without the exhaustive polling and focus group testing that would have characterized such choices under Diane's leadership. Set it up for this afternoon if possible. And Taylor, no prep team, no scripted responses, no campaign-approved talking points. Susan and I will speak honestly about where we've been and where we're going from here. Taylor appeared momentarily startled by this departure from standard procedure but recovered quickly. Understood. And for the donor calls? I'll handle those personally, Robert decided. They deserve to hear directly from me about the campaign's direction moving forward, not from staff reading reassurance scripts. As Taylor made notes on her tablet, I observed a subtle shift in her demeanor, a new energy replacing the careful restraint that had characterized her interactions under Diane's leadership. "Senator Mrs. Miller," she said, looking up with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. "For what it's worth, I think this approach could resonate powerfully with voters tired of perfectly packaged politicians. Authenticity is rarely featured in campaigns precisely because it can't be controlled. But that unscripted quality might be exactly what distinguishes you from typical candidates." After she left to arrange the interview, Robert and I found ourselves alone in the conference room that had been the setting for countless strategy sessions where my input had been systematically minimized or ignored. The campaign materials lining, the walls, carefully staged photographs, precisely worded slogans, meticulously designed graphics, suddenly appeared artificial and constrained compared to the authentic connection we were reclaiming. "Where do we start?" I asked, recognizing the enormity of redirecting a campaign that had been built on Diane's strategic vision. "With us," Robert replied simply. "Everything else flows from that foundation. If we're genuine in our partnership, the campaign messaging will follow naturally." The remainder of the morning unfolded in a flurry of activity: meetings with the campaign staff to explain the new direction, calls with key supporters to address concerns about Diane's departure, preparations for the interview that would essentially relaunch the campaign with a fundamentally different approach. Throughout it all, I remained by Robert's side, our partnership visible and authentic in a way it hadn't been since before his candidacy. The campaign headquarters itself seemed to transform as the day progressed. Staff members who had previously addressed me with careful formality began engaging directly, seeking my input on community outreach initiatives, educational policy positions, and event planning. The atmosphere shifted from the tightly controlled environment Diane had maintained to something more collaborative and energetic. By early afternoon, word of the campaign's dramatic shift had spread throughout Riverdale's political circles. My phone buzzed with text messages from friends I hadn't heard from in months, people who had gradually stopped including me in social gatherings as my role in Robert's public life diminished. "Everyone's curious about what happened," I told Robert as we prepared for the interview with Melissa Chen. "Sarah from the library board, Elena from the Education Foundation, even my old department chair, they're all reaching out." "They probably expect drama and scandal," Robert observed wryly. "Political implosion makes for interesting conversation." "Or maybe they're responding to authenticity," I suggested. "Perhaps seeing us reclaim our partnership gives them permission to reconnect in a way Diane's carefully managed narrative discouraged." The observer's offices occupied a modest building downtown, its mid-century architecture a contrast to the sleek modernity of campaign headquarters. Melissa Chen met us in the lobby, her professional demeanor tempered with genuine warmth as she greeted both of us with equal attention. A subtle but meaningful departure from most political reporters who typically focused primarily on Robert. "Thank you for making time on such short notice," she said, leading us to a small conference room rather than the formal interview set I had expected. "I appreciate the opportunity for a substantive conversation rather than the typical campaign sound bites." "That's precisely why we chose you for this interview," Robert replied. Melissa clarified, her eyebrows rising. "At a campaign fundraiser that happened to coincide with our anniversary," Robert corrected, the distinction making the situation's absurdity even clearer. That's how thoroughly the political narrative had overtaken our actual lives. Melissa made a few notes before continuing. This raises obvious questions about campaign management. I understand Diane Campbell resigned this morning after 18 months directing your campaign strategy. She did, Robert confirmed. Diane is exceptionally talented at crafting effective political narratives, but her approach fundamentally conflicted with the direction we're taking moving forward. Which is? Melissa prompted. I answered before Robert could, the words flowing naturally rather than from prepared remarks. Authenticity, genuine partnership rather than strategic positioning, a campaign that reflects the reality of our 30-year marriage rather than a focus-grouped simulation designed to appeal to target demographics. Melissa's interest visibly increased. That's a remarkable departure from standard political strategy. Most consultants would consider such unfiltered authenticity extraordinarily risky. It is risky, Robert acknowledged. But continuing, to compromise the foundation of my personal life for political advancement was ultimately a greater risk. To our marriage, to my integrity, and ironically, to the very values my campaign claims to represent. How do you respond to critics who might characterize this as a campaign in disarray? Melissa asked, her tone professional, but not adversarial. Your opponent's spokesperson has already released a statement suggesting these changes indicate internal turmoil and questionable leadership. Robert smiled slightly. I'd say they're half right. There was indeed internal turmoil, the kind that comes from recognizing a fundamental disconnect between personal values and public presentation. As for leadership, I believe genuine leadership sometimes requires course correction when you recognize you're moving in the wrong direction, regardless of how carefully that direction was planned. Even if that correction might cost you the election? Even then, Robert confirmed without hesitation, no political office is worth sacrificing the relationship that has been the foundation of everything meaningful in my life. The interview continued for nearly an hour, covering not just the campaign's directional shift, but substantive policy positions, community initiatives, and educational reforms that had been core to Robert's platform, but often overshadowed by Diane's focus on image and narrative control. Throughout, I found myself naturally engaged in the conversation, offering perspectives on educational issues from my teaching background and community concerns from my involvement with local organizations, contributions that would have been carefully limited under previous campaign protocols. As Melissa concluded the interview, she set aside her professional demeanor momentarily. Off the record, she said, switching off her recorder, I've covered 6 Senate campaigns, and I've never seen a candidate willingly abandon message discipline for authentic engagement this close to an election. It's either political malpractice or the most refreshing approach I've encountered. Perhaps both, Robert suggested with genuine humor. We'll find out on election day. Either way, I added, we'll face the results together, which matters more than the outcome itself. After leaving the observers' offices, we walked through downtown Riverdale rather than immediately returning to campaign headquarters. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the streets where Robert's campaign posters were displayed in shop windows and on community bulletin boards, each featuring his carefully composed image without me visible anywhere. Those will need updating, I observed, nodding toward a particularly prominent poster outside the community center. Everything will, Robert agreed, his hand finding mine naturally as we continued walking. Campaign materials, event schedules, communication strategy. It's essentially a complete relaunch with just weeks remaining before the election. Are you worried? I asked, studying his expression. He considered the question thoughtfully, before responding. About the election? Yes, if I'm being honest. Diane wasn't wrong about the potential political consequences of such a dramatic shift in approach. But about our decision to make this change? Not for a moment. Some things matter more than winning. We paused outside Miller's Diner, where Edith was arranging a fresh pie display in the front window. She spotted us and waved enthusiastically, gesturing for us to come inside. As we entered, The familiar bell above the door announced our arrival, drawing the attention of several regular customers who seemed surprised to see Robert in the middle of a weekday without a campaign entourage. "Twice in 24 hours, Edith said approvingly, wiping her hands on her apron. "You two finally remembering what matters, eh?" "We're trying," I replied, touched by her perceptiveness. "Well, sit yourselves down," she insisted, pointing to our usual corner booth. "Campaign. Can wait long enough for a slice of fresh blueberry pie." As we settled into the booth that had hosted countless conversations throughout our marriage, Robert reached across the table to take my hand, the gesture unhurried and genuine rather than positioned for maximum visual impact as campaign appearances had trained him to consider. "We're just getting started," he said quietly. "Redirecting the campaign, reclaiming our authentic partnership. It won't be simple or straightforward. There will be political consequences, practical challenges, relationships to rebuild." "No," I acknowledged. "But for the first time in 3 years, we're facing those challenges together, as partners rather than as candidate and carefully managed spouse. Whatever happens with the election, that already feels like victory." Edith arrived with 2 slices of pie and fresh coffee, setting them down with a knowing smile before discreetly withdrawing. Through the diner window, I could see Campaign. Headquarters in the distance, its windows reflecting the afternoon sunlight, its interior buzzing with the activity of redirecting a political narrative weeks before an election. The outcome remained uncertain. Polls would fluctuate. Donors might withdraw. Voters would ultimately render their verdict on this unconventional approach to campaigning. But as Robert and I shared pie in our corner booth, engaging in genuine conversation without campaign considerations filtering every word, I felt a certainty that transcended political uncertainties. Whatever path lay ahead, we would walk it. Together, our partnership authentic and undiminished by strategic calculation or political expediency. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't simply adjacent to Robert's journey. I was fully part of it, my voice acknowledged, my presence valued not for its demographic appeal, but for the 30 years of shared history and genuine partnership it represented. The political outcome of this authentic approach remained to be seen, but the personal victory had already been secured at a corner table in Miller's Diner, over blueberry pie and unscripted conversation about the future we would face together. The 3 weeks that followed our confrontation with Diane transformed both our marriage and the campaign in ways neither of us could have predicted. The day after her resignation, The Observer published Melissa Chen's interview under the headline, "Miller Campaign Embraces Authenticity, a Political Risk Worth Taking." What might have been portrayed as campaign chaos was instead framed as a deliberate choice to prioritize genuine connection, Robert asked, his arm resting comfortably around my shoulders, rather than carefully positioned for maximum visual impact as previous campaign protocols would have dictated. "It's essentially a statistical tie," Taylor replied. "But the trend line is positive, especially in the demographics Diane considered lost causes, younger voters, educational professionals, and suburban women who previously viewed the campaign as too polished to be genuine." "Diane would say we're proving her point about message discipline," I observed, now comfortable offering perspectives in campaign settings where I'd previously remained silent. "By abandoning it, we've lost ground with established supporters." "Perhaps," Taylor acknowledged, "but we've also expanded the potential voter base in ways her approach couldn't access. People are responding to seeing an authentic 30-year partnership rather than a carefully curated political image. The evidence of this response manifested beyond polling numbers. Campaign events that had once been meticulously orchestrated performances became interactive conversations. Robert and I appearing together, addressing questions without prepared talking points, sharing genuine moments that sometimes included disagreement or different perspectives on issues. Rather than undermining campaign messaging as Diane had feared, these unscripted interactions demonstrated the authentic partnership that formed the foundation of Robert's values. Community engagement. transformed as well. I returned to the literacy program at the library, no longer worried that such demographically limited activities might detract from the campaign's carefully targeted messaging. When local press covered my involvement, they framed it as evidence of genuine commitment to education rather than a strategic campaign appearance, precisely the authenticity we had sacrificed under Diane's approach. Most meaningful was the transformation in our private life, which gradually reclaimed space from the political demands that had consumed it. Our home slowly returned to being our sanctuary, rather than a campaign backdrop, campaign furniture. Replaced with our comfortable pieces from storage, politically strategic decor exchanged for the personal items that reflected 30 years of shared history. This morning marked 3 weeks since our anniversary celebration had catalyzed these changes. I stood in our kitchen preparing coffee, watching through the window as Robert chatted with our neighbor across the driveway. An ordinary moment that would have been impossible under previous campaign protocols requiring staff presence for any potentially public interaction. "Morning," Robert said, entering through the back door and accepting the coffee mug I offered. "Jim's daughter just got accepted to Riverdale Community College, thinking about teaching." "That's wonderful," I replied, the simple exchange representative of how normal conversations had returned to our daily life. "I'd be happy to talk with her about the education program if she's interested." Robert smiled, the expression genuine rather than the camera-ready version Diane had drilled into him. "I told him you'd say exactly that. Some things never change, despite political consultants' best efforts." Before I could respond, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting to something more complex. "Campaign headquarters," he said, answering and activating the speaker function. "Good morning, Taylor." "Senator Mrs. Miller?" Taylor's voice carried a note of urgency that immediately heightened our attention. "Have you seen this morning's courier?" "Not yet," Robert replied, exchanging a concerned glance with me. "What's happening?" "They're running a feature on Diane Campbell," Taylor explained. "She's given an extensive interview about her resignation and the campaign's dramatic, strategic missteps. It's not flattering." "That's not surprising," I said, unsurprised that Diane would eventually share her perspective on the campaign's direction. She fundamentally disagreed with our approach. "It goes beyond professional disagreement," Taylor continued. "She's characterized the shift as emotional decision-making undermining rational campaign strategy, and suggested the campaign is being driven by personal feelings rather than political realities." Robert sighed, though he didn't appear shocked. Again, not unexpected from Diane's perspective. Her whole approach was predicated on strategic calculation over authentic engagement. "There's more," Taylor added, her tone indicating she was choosing her words carefully. She specifically mentions Susan's ultimatum regarding campaign finances and references legal documents presented at the anniversary event that forced a crisis of direction. The reference to the prenuptial agreement in Catherine's documents sent a chill through me. While we hadn't concealed their existence, we'd chosen not to center our public narrative around the financial leverage they represented, focusing instead on the positive choice to reclaim authentic partnership. "That's a significant mischaracterization," Robert replied, his voice tightening slightly. "We've been transparent about the campaign's directional shift, but we've never publicly discussed private financial arrangements. The article heavily implies Susan used financial leverage to force campaign changes," Taylor continued. "Diane never directly states the nature of the documents, but she references legally binding financial conditions that superseded campaign considerations." I set my coffee mug down, feeling suddenly cold despite the warm kitchen. "She's making it sound like I blackmailed the campaign rather than reclaimed my place in my own marriage." "Exactly," Taylor confirmed. "The framing suggests strategic manipulation rather than authentic partnership." It's clearly designed to undermine the narrative we've built over the past 3 weeks." Robert's expression hardened in a way I hadn't seen since before our reconciliation. "Is Diane available for comment beyond what's in the article?" "She's scheduled an appearance on Capitol Report this evening," Taylor replied. The producer reached out for our response or counter-appearance. "We'll both appear," Robert decided immediately, looking to me for confirmation. "This needs to be addressed directly and honestly, not through prepared statements or surrogate responses." I nodded, though anxiety twisted in my stomach at the thought of discussing our private marital arrangements on regional television. "Agreed. If we're committed to authenticity, we can't suddenly retreat behind strategic messaging when it becomes uncomfortable." "I'll arrange it," Taylor confirmed. "The show airs at 7. They've offered the full 30-minute segment given the significance of the story." After ending the call, Robert and I sat in silence for a moment, the peaceful morning suddenly overshadowed by this new challenge. The courier sat unopened on our front porch, containing Diane's public assessment of our marriage and campaign. "We should read it," I finally said. "Before we respond, we need to know exactly what she's claiming." Robert nodded. "Documents presented by Mrs. Miller's attorney created a crisis situation where campaign considerations became secondary to private financial arrangements." I continued reading where he stopped. "While I respect the Millers' marriage, effective campaigns cannot be guided by emotional reactions or personal ultimatums. Senator Miller was positioned for victory with data-driven messaging that resonated with key demographics. The current approach represents a fundamental misunderstanding of political realities. She's positioning herself as the rational professional, undermined by emotional amateurs," Robert observed, his tone more resigned than angry. "It's a narrative designed to protect her professional reputation by suggesting any campaign failures result from rejecting her strategic guidance. And she's casting me as the manipulative spouse using financial threats rather than a partner reclaiming authentic participation in my own marriage," I added, the characterization stinging despite my intellectual understanding of Diane's motives. "It completely misrepresents what happened at the anniversary event." Robert reached across the table, taking my hand in a gesture that had once again become natural rather than calculated. "Which is why we need to address it directly. Not with counterattacks or defensive positioning, but with the same authenticity we've committed to these past weeks." The remainder of the day unfolded with increasing intensity as news of Diane's interview spread through political circles. The campaign office fielded dozens of media inquiries, major donors called seeking reassurance, and social media buzzed with speculation about the financial ultimatum Diane had referenced without specifically detailing. Catherine called mid-afternoon, her tone professionally measured despite obvious concern. "I've seen the courier piece. While she's careful not to directly mention the prenuptial agreement, she's clearly implying you leveraged financial control to force campaign changes." "That's her interpretation," I acknowledged. "We're appearing on Capitol Report tonight to address it directly." "Be careful," Catherine advised. "Discussing private financial arrangements in a political context could create complications beyond campaign messaging. There are potential legal and financial privacy considerations." "What would you recommend?" I asked, valuing her perspective as both a legal expert and a friend who understood the personal stakes involved. "Focus on the emotional truth rather than financial details," she suggested after considering the question. "The core issue wasn't the legal leverage, but the recognition that your marriage had been compromised for political expediency. You don't need to reveal specific financial arrangements to convey that essential truth." As evening approached, Robert and I prepared for the interview with a frankness that would have been impossible under Diane's leadership. Rather than rehearsing scripted responses or reviewing talking points, we discussed our genuine feelings about the situation and how to communicate honestly without unnecessary personal disclosures. "We don't need to discuss specific financial details," Robert emphasized as we drove to the television studio. "The prenuptial agreement's provisions are private matters. What's relevant is the broader realization that I had allowed campaign strategy to undermine our marriage. And the documents Catherine brought weren't delivered as an ultimatum, I added, still troubled by Diane's characterization. They represented options, potential leverage I never actually exercised because our conversation took a different direction. The Capitol Report studio occupied the top floor of a downtown office building, its windowed backdrop showcasing Riverdale's modest skyline. As we were escorted to makeup and preliminary preparation, I noticed Diane already seated in the green room, reviewing notes with practiced concentration. She glanced up as we passed, her expression professionally neutral despite the circumstances. Robert paused in the doorway. "Diane." "Senator Miller," she replied with formal politeness, deliberately avoiding using his first name as she had throughout their professional relationship, Mrs. Miller. "I wish we were meeting under different circumstances," Robert said, his tone genuinely regretful rather than politically calculated. "Regardless of our professional disagreements, I've always respected your expertise." Diane's expression softened slightly, though her posture remained defensive. "I stand by my assessment of the campaign's strategic direction. The interview simply presents the professional perspective that needs to be part of the public record. By mischaracterizing private matters you weren't fully privy to," I noted, keeping my tone calm despite the frustration I felt at her public portrayal of our marriage. "I characterized the impact on campaign strategy, which falls squarely within my professional expertise," Diane countered. "The public deserves to understand how personal considerations have reshaped a political campaign they're being asked to support." Before the conversation could continue, a production assistant appeared to escort us to separate preparation areas. The brief exchange had clarified something important. Diane genuinely believed her perspective represented necessary professional context rather than personal attack. Her commitment to strategic political calculation was so complete that she viewed our authentic approach as fundamentally misguided rather than simply different. The interview setup placed Robert and me on one side of the studio, with Diane positioned opposite, the veteran host Marcus Reynolds seated between us at the central desk. As final lighting adjustments were made, Robert squeezed my hand reassuringly. "Just be yourself," he whispered. "That's what this whole journey has been about, reclaiming authentic partnership over political calculation." 60 seconds to air, the floor director announced, the studio lights brightening to full intensity. Marcus Reynolds turned to the main camera, his expression shifting to the authoritative demeanor that had characterized his political reporting for 2 decades. "Good evening, and welcome to a special edition of Capitol Report. Tonight, an exclusive conversation about politics, partnership, and the personal calculations behind public campaigns. 3 weeks ago, the Miller campaign underwent a dramatic strategic shift following an anniversary celebration that transformed into something unexpected. Tonight, for the first time, we hear directly from all parties involved about what happened and what it means for voters in the upcoming election." The camera panned to include all participants as Marcus continued his introduction. Joining us are State Senate candidate Robert Miller and his wife Susan, along with former campaign manager Diane Campbell, whose interview in this morning's Courier raised significant questions about the campaign's direction. "Thank you all for being here." "Thank you for having us," Robert replied, his voice carrying the natural warmth that had returned since abandoning Diane's carefully modulated campaign tone. "Ms. Campbell," Marcus began, turning to Diane, "your interview this morning characterized the Miller campaign's strategic shift as resulting from a financial ultimatum, rather than thoughtful reconsideration of messaging. Could you elaborate on that assessment?" Diane sat perfectly straight, her posture reflecting the professional poise she had always emphasized in campaign appearances. "Certainly. Political campaigns operate on carefully calibrated strategic messaging designed to resonate with key voter demographics. The Miller campaign had developed an effective approach backed by extensive polling data and focus group testing. That approach was abruptly abandoned following an anniversary event where Mrs. Miller's attorney presented documents that created immediate financial considerations, superseding campaign strategy. To be clear, Marcus pressed, are you suggesting Mrs. Miller threatened financial consequences if campaign strategy wasn't changed? I'm stating that documents with significant financial implications were introduced during what was scheduled as a campaign fundraising event, Diane replied. Carefully. Following their presentation, Senator Miller made immediate decisions counter to established campaign strategy without consulting the professional team that had positioned him for electoral success. Marcus turned toward us, his expression neutral but engaged. Senator Miller, Mrs. Miller, how do you respond to this characterization of events? Robert looked at me briefly, a silent confirmation of our partnership before responding. Marcus, what Diane describes as established campaign strategy had systematically diminished my wife's role in both the campaign and our marriage. At our own anniversary celebration, Susan was seated at a separate table near the kitchen while I was positioned with donors at the main table. That moment crystallized how completely I had allowed political calculation to override authentic partnership. And the documents Ms. Campbell referenced? Marcus prompted. I decided to address this directly, drawing on Catherine's advice, to focus on emotional truth rather than financial details. My friend Catherine, who happens to be an attorney, did bring documentation regarding our prenuptial agreement, which included provisions that took effect after 25 years of marriage. But characterizing this as a financial ultimatum fundamentally misrepresents what happened. Those documents were never delivered as threats or demands, Robert added. They represented options Susan had chosen not to exercise despite 3 years of being gradually erased from her own marriage for political expediency. The revelation wasn't that she could assert financial leverage, but that I had compromised something far more valuable than any political office by allowing campaign strategy to undermine our 30-year partnership. Diane shook her head slightly, her expression reflecting genuine professional concern rather than personal animosity. With respect, this emotional framing obscures the practical reality that established campaign messaging was abandoned weeks before an election based on personal considerations rather than strategic assessment. Whatever the private motivations, the public impact is a campaign that has sacrificed proven messaging for unscripted authenticity that polling data indicated would be less effective with key demographics. Is that assessment supported by current polling? Marcus asked, directing the question to both sides. The most recent data shows statistical parity, Robert acknowledged, though with different constituent composition than under previous messaging. We've lost some support among traditional donors, but gained traction with voters who respond to authentic engagement over carefully packaged political narratives. So, the campaign is potentially sacrificing electoral success for personal authenticity, Marcus summarized, framing the central question. That perspective assumes authentic partnership and political success are mutually exclusive, I responded, finding my voice stronger than expected in this high-pressure setting. The reality is that voters are intelligent enough to recognize when they're being presented with a carefully managed political product versus genuine human connection. Our approach simply acknowledges that truth rather than attempting to manipulate it. Diane leaned forward slightly, her professional expertise evident in her precise articulation. Political campaigns aren't about manipulation, but effective communication of policy positions and candidate qualifications. Strategic messaging isn't deception. It's professional presentation designed to connect with diverse voter concerns across complex demographic landscapes. Yet that professional presentation required my wife to eat alone at our anniversary celebration while I focused on strategic donor interactions. Robert countered, the simple statement cutting through campaign, terminology to the human reality beneath. At what point does strategic messaging become fundamentally dishonest if it requires erasing authentic relationships to maintain? The interview continued for nearly 30 minutes, exploring the tension between political strategy and personal authenticity, between professional campaign management and genuine human connection. Throughout, Diane maintained her position that effective campaigns required disciplined messaging based on demographic analysis, while Robert and I advocated for authenticity even when politically unpredictable. As the segment concluded, Marcus turned to the camera for his final thoughts. Politics has always balanced personal conviction with strategic presentation, authentic belief with effective communication. The Miller campaign now offers voters an unusual choice, a candidate who has deliberately abandoned conventional political packaging in favor of unscripted authenticity, for better or worse. Whether this approach represents the future of political engagement or a strategic miscalculation will ultimately be decided by voters themselves. After the cameras stopped rolling, an unexpected moment occurred as we prepared to leave the studio. Diane approached us directly, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "I stand by my assessment of campaign strategy," she said quietly. "But I want to be clear that my interview wasn't intended as a personal attack. I believe voters deserve transparency about how campaign decisions are made, including when professional strategy is overridden by personal considerations." "I understand that perspective," Robert replied with genuine respect rather than political diplomacy. "We simply reached different conclusions about what matters most, both personally and politically." "For what it's worth," Diane added, looking directly at me for perhaps the first time without calculating my demographic impact, "I never intended to diminish your marriage. I was focused exclusively on electoral strategy based on data that indicated certain approaches would be more effective with target voters." "That's the fundamental difference in our perspectives," I replied, appreciating her sincerity while maintaining my position. "Some things shouldn't be subjected to polling data and demographic analysis, including authentic partnership." Diane nodded, accepting the philosophical divide between us. "I wish you both well, regardless of electoral outcomes. Professional disagreements aside, 30 years of marriage is something worthy of genuine celebration, not strategic management." As we left the studio and headed home through the quiet evening streets, Robert took my hand, the gesture now naturally affectionate rather than politically calculated for potential observers. "That went as well as could be expected," he observed. Diane presented her perspective honestly without personal attacks, and we maintained authentic engagement, without unnecessary disclosures about private financial matters. The contrast in approaches was evident throughout, I agreed. Diane genuinely believes in strategic messaging as effective political communication, not manipulation or deception. She just doesn't understand why someone would prioritize authentic partnership over proven campaign tactics. "Because she's never valued anything more than political success," Robert said thoughtfully. "Her entire professional identity is built around achieving electoral victories through strategic messaging and demographic targeting. The idea of risking that for personal authenticity is incomprehensible within her framework." We arrived home to find several messages waiting, Taylor with initial media reactions to the interview, Catherine checking that we had maintained appropriate privacy regarding financial arrangements, and surprisingly, a text from Melissa Chen at The Observer. "Just watched Capitol Report. Most authentic political conversation I've witnessed in 15 years of campaign coverage. Regardless of election outcome, you've changed the conversation about authenticity in public service." As we prepared for bed that night, the campaign headquarters still buzzing with activity despite the late hour as staff monitored media response and prepared for the final weeks before Election Day, Robert paused by the bedroom window that overlooked our backyard. "Whatever happens with the election," he said quietly, "I won't regret choosing authentic partnership over political calculation. Some things matter more than winning. Though winning would be nice validation that authenticity can succeed politically," I acknowledged with a small smile. "It would," he agreed. "But even if we lose, we've already won something more valuable: the reclamation of our genuine partnership from the strategic management that nearly erased it. As I joined him by the window, looking out at the yard where we'd raised our children, hosted neighborhood gatherings, and built 30 years of shared memories, I felt a certainty that transcended political uncertainties. Whatever the election, results might bring, we would face them together as genuine partners rather than strategic political. 2 weeks remained before Election Day. 2 weeks of campaign events, policy discussions, media appearances, and voter outreach. But unlike the carefully managed political performance of previous months, these activities would unfold with authentic engagement rather than strategic calculation, with genuine partnership rather than demographic targeting. The prenuptial agreement that had sparked this transformation remained safely stored away, its provisions never actually invoked, because the simple recognition of its existence had been sufficient to prompt the necessary reevaluation of priorities. The financial leverage it represented hadn't been needed to reclaim my place in our marriage once Robert recognized what truly mattered beyond political advancement. As we turned away from the window and prepared for the challenges ahead, I felt a quiet confidence that hadn't been possible during the years of gradual erasure. Whatever the political outcome, we had already achieved the most important victory: the reclamation of authentic partnership over strategic management, of genuine connection over calculated presentation. The campaign that had once relegated me to a corner table at my own anniversary celebration had been transformed into a shared journey characterized by honest engagement rather than polling data. The voters would ultimately decide whether this approach deserved electoral support, but the personal decision to prioritize authentic partnership had already proven its value far beyond political calculation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.